Science on Surfaces, a bigger perspective on the small.
So welcome to this podcast, Science on Surfaces, a bigger perspective on the small, where we zoom in on science that impacts our everyday lives. Today we will talk about CCS, carbon capture and storage. And here with me in the studio I have Bengt Kasemo, Professor of Physics at Chalmers University of Technology. And I also have Filip Johnson, Professor at the Division of Energy Technology, also at Chalmers. Welcome.
Thank you.
So let's just start with the basics. CCS, what is that?
Well, it stands, as you said, for carbon capture and storage. So yes. Basically what it is that if you have a large point source of emissions from like a power plant or some industry, you want to capture the CO2, the carbon dioxide in the flue gases, and compress it and transport it to a storage location for permanent storage, so that you remove it from the atmosphere or from entering the atmosphere. So this is in short what it is.
So it's preventing CO2 from entering the atmosphere.
Exactly. And yeah, I mean, you could think of that you store the entire flue gas, but it would be very large volume, and it's also not allowed. So you have a lot of inert gases like nitrogen, primarily in the flue gases. So so typically you may have like 10-15% of CO2 concentration in the flue gas.
Okay, and so the main purpose for using this is due to climate, like our climate challenge.
Yeah,
right?
To mitigate climate change. So this is, I would say, the only purpose, and that maybe is one maybe of the challenges, and there is no other sort of additional benefits, you could say. I mean, if you apply it to the electricity generation systems or power plants, say a coal-fired power plant. I mean, there are different. Of course, you need a portfolio of measures to remove to reduce CO2 emissions to the atmosphere. But if you compare it to renewables, of course, with the renewables you get a lot of other benefits. Of course, it's I mean, other pollutants that you don't. You can stop using coal and so has also other environmental positive effects. But CCS is only, so to say, for mitigating CO2 emissions. You could argue maybe that in countries that have large endowments or reserves of fossil fuels, of course, they can continue using their domestic fuel reserves. So for security supply, it could be positive, so to say.
So it's a good thing. And now you describe it as we are using this quite a lot. Is that the case?
No, that's not the case, and that's the problem.
Yeah. Okay. So how much are we using it?
Well,
globally,
one could say that we are not using it at all, because I mean, the technology is there. It has there are different. We can maybe discuss that later, but there are different types of capture technologies, principles, and several of those have been tested, and some of these processes are already today applied for instance, in the chemical industry, but at another scale and for other purposes. But there are today globally around 20, which one may call larger CCS projects, meaning that they maybe capture some 400,000 tons of CO2 per year. But a majority of those are in connection to what is called EOR, or enhanced oil recovery. So they actually, the purpose is to increase the oil production, in particular for oil fields that are old. So that's obviously not really a climate mitigation.
So it's not released into the atmosphere, but it's helping create new sources of. So okay. And also I wanted to add, you said how many 100,000 tons did you say that we are capturing?
I mean, these 20 projects, I mean, for example, there is one of them in Saskatchewan at a coal-fired power plant in North America, in Canada. They are typically 200 to 400,000, up to maybe 500,000 tons CO2 per year, so 0.5 megatons of CO2.
Yeah.
And the Swedish total CO2 emissions from all sectors is about 40 megaton. But if you look at typical where you would apply CCS, these processes to get the reasonable specific capture cost, which is typically measured in euro per ton of CO2 captured, you would need fairly large point sources, say from at least 100,000 ton, but preferable half a million ton per year, so to bring down costs.
So I think I read somewhere that we release about 40 billion tons CO2 globally.
Is
globally,
that correct? That's true.
Globally.
Yeah.
And so we are not capturing even a fraction of that.
Exactly.
Which means that if we were going to capture all that, we would have to implement loads of CCS.
I mean, of course, as I said, there are of course a whole portfolio of mitigation technologies, and of course, it's of course best if we can go away from the fossil fuels for a starter. So basically, I mean, the argument, I would say maybe the only valid but very important argument or reason for that CCS is important is that with the fossil fuels there are only two options if we're going to comply with say Paris Agreement to limit temperature increase to well below 2 centigrades. That is either to leave these fossil fuels or reserves in the ground, or to apply CCS, and a combination, of course. So basically the cost of CCS defines the marginal cost of using fossil fuels, or if you talk to an economist, to internalize the externalities of using fossil fuels. So this, I would say, is the main argument for CCS. Then maybe there are two other sub-arguments, or one is that several of the industrial processes we have in the basic industry for steel, cement, petrochemical industries, there exist really no other options for much of the emissions to mitigate those. So CCS, for instance, for the cement industry, you have two emission. We can divide emissions in two parts. It's the energy-related emissions and the process-related emissions. And the energy-related emissions, you could think of, you can change fuels from fossils to renewable, or you could electrify the process. But for the process-related ones, the CO2 that's created in the calcination step, those are not possible to. It's sort of inherent in the process. So for those you need CCS. But you could also take almost all emissions with CCS. So. And the third reason for CCS is that, as you probably have seen in the news, is that if we're going to limit warming to say 1.5 degrees Celsius, or well below 2 centigrades, we will most likely very soon, if not we have already, have emitted too much greenhouse gases, and in particular CO2. So we actually need, on the longer term, to actually create net negative emissions.
And what does that mean?
So that means that they actually take out more CO2 from the atmosphere than we emit. And there are some ways to do this. One is to increase the biogenic stock, so we land use change, so we forestation, for instance. And the other is to use that sort of sustainable grown biomass to burn it instead of coal or oil, and then apply capture on that. And if it is assumed or you can prove that the carbon stock is not diminished, that it is growing, so that you don't take out more biomass than what corresponds to what the growth rate, then if you apply CCS, you get sort of net negative emissions from that. You could also actually use the same processes as for CCS, or for at least one of the principles of carbon capture to apply it directly on the atmosphere. So this is often called DAC, or direct air capture. And the good thing with that is that you don't need to link the capture process to the emission source. So you can put them, for instance, very close to these capture units where you have storage opportunities. The disadvantage and challenge for that is, of course, that it's much more costly to capture CO2 from the atmosphere, where you have 410 or what it is ppm CO2, compared to a flue gas where you have maybe 10 or more percent CO2.
Yeah.
So that makes it much more expensive.
Yeah. You briefly just mentioned like how you capture how you capture or how you separate the gas.
Yeah,
I think, could you describe this a bit more, how that works?
Yeah, I mean the whole, as I said, all these technologies, the principle is that you want to remove the CO2 from the gas, from the flue gas, the total flue gas, at the lowest cost as possible. So you can do this. The most developed one is called post-combustion. That means that you basically, as any other cleaning equipment for flue gas cleaning, you apply it after the process, meaning also that you can retrofit an existing process.
So you have an exhaust and then you
exactly
remove the CO2
and those
from
are typically based on solvents. So you have like an amine that you have an absorber, and then you change the temperature levels. So you have a desorber where so the CO2 is dissolved in this amine solution, and then you release it in a desorber. So it's a temperature-based process, and so it's the regeneration of the absorbent that creates the energy consumption. So all these comes with an energy cost. So that's the reason why it's quite costly to capture CO2. So that's one way. So post-combustion. Another that I have worked with, we started a group in early 2000, is oxy-fuel combustion. So that then it's a new process, but it's very similar to a normal combustion. But so basically what we do then is, instead of combusting your fuel in air, you combust your fuel in pure oxygen, so you have no nitrogen, and recirculated flue gas, because of limits to limit the temperature. And then your flue gas out from the process will consist only of CO2.
Okay.
So you sort of not have that inert gases. So that's a second group of but it is one technology, so to say. And then a third way would be to separate, to have a sort of a gasification process called pre-combustion. So you basically separate out the hydrogen before the process, and burn hydrogen in for instance, a gas turbine, and then you capture the carbon in that way instead.
Okay. And then you said the post-combustion is the one that is mostly used.
I mean, as I said, there are not very many projects globally,
right,
but that process, scrubbing, amine scrubbing, it's applied in chemical industry for many different purposes, and they're also possible to there are companies that sell those. So there are a few projects, and for instance, I mentioned this coal-fired power plant in Saskatchewan in Canada, and they apply this.
Because it's easy or cheap, maybe.
Not cheap. I mean, they come at about the same cost.
Okay.
All these, I mean, they have some pros and cons, but so they're quite costly. I mean, in the order of €100 per ton CO2, or for the whole capture, transport, and storage, and maybe the capture vary from. We actually developed a marginal abatement cost curve for the Swedish emission sources, and with post-combustion, and it spans from say 45 euros per ton up to 140 euros per ton for the capture part, and then the transport and storage is a smaller part, but it's say another 20 or so euro per ton. So
okay.
If you translate these figures you just mentioned to, let's say, you retrofit for a German power station, coal-fired power station, and you have a certain price per kilowatt hour that you produce, and then you retrofit it with the cheapest technique. How much does the price per kilowatt hour increase?
Yeah, it's maybe 50 to 100%, depending. It depends very much on how you count, because there are very many different contracts on the electricity. But if you look at the production cost of electricity, I would say 50 to 100% increase in the electricity price.
So what you're saying is that if the price per kilowatt hour almost doubles, if there was a ban on CO2 emission, or a cost of CO2 emission, it need to be so high that it covers, make a competitive process. You would need to increase the price of the non-cleaned source. You had to by taxes or by CO2.
Yeah, I mean exactly. I mean the if you look at in Europe, these emission sources are the policy measure that controls these are the EU ETS, the emission trading system, and the problem has been that when we worked with this in during from 2003 and up to 2010. Everyone thought that this EU ETS allowance price would increase up to basically now around year 2020 would be 30 euros per ton, and then it would just increase. In fact, it is almost 30 euros per ton now, but the difference was that for many years it was very low, so maybe let's say 5, 6, 7 euros per ton. So far too low to get this in place, and as well as many other measures. So you need a tax or this EU ETS price, and it needs to be, since as we just started our discussion with that there is no other real benefit of CCS. It really must be driven by a cost to emit CO2, whereas you could think of that renewables you would maybe want for other reasons as well. So that's.
Of course, industry would say that to double the price is a giant step, but for me as a layman, it doesn't seem too bad.
No. One thing that we've done is, and I think that's, and actually we got some publicity for, is that we look at value chains. So for instance, steel and cement. If you want to reduce the CO2 emissions to basically zero with this technology, you need a portfolio technology, but CCS is a big part in it, and that will cost, say, around 100 euro per ton of CO2. And so then the cement and the steel will be more expensive. So the cement, we calculated, will be around 70% more expensive, and the steel 25% more expensive. And in particular, steel is sort of global competition, so they are very afraid of increasing their production price if that's not sort of similar globally or on their competitive markets. But if you recalculate that, if you do these measures at 100 euro per ton, and then you see, we looked at a building of CO2-free cement and concrete and steel, and a car in CO2-free steel, that would only increase the price. So we actually look at some profit margins as well. The price would be less than 0.5%. So I think that the important when looking at this, and the same is with electricity to some extent, is also in the beginning of the value chain. So one have to look at where is this used and how much would it be in the end product and services. So I think that this is just one way of showing that to mitigate global warming or to overcome this challenge for the, as part of the share of the total value creation in society is actually rather small, which was already shown in the Stern review that and others have shown it on a global level, so to say. So in that sense, I think it's we have to think more in this way, and already now there are a lot of companies that want they're concerned about their carbon footprint, and then say that IKEA, for instance, I don't know if they do this, but say that maybe they go to Schenker and ask for, if we buy logistic systems of you, what's the carbon footprint, and then Schenker goes to Scania that deliver their or Volvo that deliver their trucks. If we buy cars from you or trucks from you, what's the carbon footprint, and then Scania Volvo goes to SSAB that provides the steel. If we buy steel from you, and so on. And if you look in that way, then I think there is a tendency to that there is an increased willingness to pay for this. The trick is, of course, to transfer in a transparent way this €100 per ton at the source to the end of the value chain, and maybe label the product, this is carbon free, and we have there was a master thesis work now looked at the value chain from pulp and paper industry, because if they apply CCS, it would be negative emissions, according to what we discussed just before. And we looked at some products, some consumer product, like a dairy product that are in these containers, a small package of milk, for instance. And if you apply this CCS or this BECCS, that we call it bioenergy CCS, it will reduce emissions significantly. We looked at all emissions also from the product, so it was not CO2 free, but it was at least substantial decrease. And the price increase of this product would be almost nothing. I mean, so like it was very, very small. So I think this is something that we need to society need to look more into.
But you also mentioned that it's pretty expensive now and it needs to be cheaper to capture. But what can be done to reduce the cost, the capture cost?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, it can for sure be cheaper, and there are also research on other technologies that are more say second generation, hopefully, of these capture technologies. But I think we cannot wait that that it will be cheaper. It's more that we need more clever ways to price emissions in society, because sometimes I fear that politicians and research community put in money. I mean, I'm working in the academia, so of course I'm happy that we'll put more effort into research, but I don't think it's research actually that we will solve, because we are really in a hurry to reduce emissions. So it's actually to start implementing and find the right driving forces to that. So. But my co-worker, Professor Anders Lyngfeldt, he is looking at something called chemical looping combustion, and then actually remove most of that inherent energy penalty of the process. But there are other challenges with that technology. But that's one example. So I mean, also if we start implementing it, you can expect a lot of innovations. I think this always happens when there is really a drive for a system or technology.
Right.
Basically, what you say is that because of the hurry, we need to use the technique that already exists.
Yeah.
Already now to get an effect, and they are good enough for that. In the meantime, of course, research can go on and maybe improve or
Absolutely.
Maybe not.
Yeah.
But if we use the techniques that exist today, which of the techniques is the most advantageous, do you think, to get scaled up?
Yeah, I mean, definitely this what I call post-combustion, because you can apply it on existing plants.
The retrofitting.
Exactly, you can just put it after the process. And that's of course very important, because we have a lot of, I mean, the turnover in capital stock of these big industries or process industry or big power plants is very long. So if we basically need to be climate neutral in 27 years or whatever, then we cannot wait for sort of an overhaul of the total process. But so that's definitely the number one that we need to apply.
And for the retrofitting, which of the different techniques there do you think are the most advantageous? Is it?
No, but that's the post-combustion technology. Yeah.
But there are several techniques, like you mentioned, the amines and sorbents. Yeah. There is one technique reacting CO2 with ammonia and separate.
But they are all based on this absorption principle. So it's just that you have different solutions. You can have chilled ammonia process is one, and the amine is one. So then there are some others, but I definitely think this. You can buy commercially this amine. They have some different mixtures that are secret. Some companies that sell those, but basically it's amine scrubbing, I would say.
So
you didn't sound optimistic when it comes to lowering the price. Isn't there an economy of scale, at least, if you...
Absolutely, yeah. And that's the reason why you need to target the quite large point sources of emissions. So definitely. And I think also we're talking about large industrial processes, a project. So what you can expect the cost reduction is rather in the assembling and putting together and the skills of implementing these. Not perhaps so much the core process itself, but I think that so maybe I'm more afraid of that the first product, because of lack of experience, will be more costly instead. So that may be the first thing we need to sort of pass that barrier. So keep the cost to these. Sometimes we refer to nth of a plant as versus first of its kind plant, so to say. Yeah.
I mean, so implementation of this CCS will help us from not releasing so much more. Could help us. But then, what about the implementation of the direct air capture that you mentioned? Don't we need to do that as well?
Yeah, most likely we need everything.
So I'm thinking if we should go from the 410 ppm or whatever it is down to somewhere around 300.
Yeah. No, but I mean that's definitely something that's that direct air capture. If you have asked me 5 years ago, I would probably say that it's really futuristic and it will be too costly. But now it's definitely something that's come up and it's seriously discussed. And there was, I think, was recently on the Swedish radio. On there is a Swiss company and they have actually looked at it and applied it in a test facility in Iceland because they have also very special, as you know, geological conditions there. So the stored carbon actually get into solid rock very fast, maybe less than a year, and they have a lot of very cheap heat to power the process. So and that's sort of a niche market for that in Iceland. So I think definitely, and also when you compare this cost in euro per ton with direct air capture, you could think that for instance, you sometimes refer to as the hard to abate sectors like aviation and agriculture, perhaps, where it's very costly or very difficult technically to reduce emissions. And with you can think of that they sort of compensate by investing in this direct air capture or CCS for that matter. But so I think definitely that is estimates give that is about 10 times more expensive than CCS, so to say, normal CCS, if I may call it that. And they claim that they can reduce that cost significantly.
But there are no plans to implement this. Like no one is really working on big scale implementation or large scale implementation.
Well, I mean there is a company that comes stems from research in Canada, and they pushed forward this technology. So, but of course since it is quite expensive, it's of course unclear where it will be. But they have this and there's also this Swiss company and that try to apply it in Iceland. So I think it will be an increased interest in it. But there are no concrete large scale plans. That's true, and certainly not in Sweden.
Okay. So you mentioned also that, I mean, you apply it to a point source, typically like a factory or something. But what about cars or?
Yeah, but that's exactly. You can't apply CCS to small distributed emission sources, in particular not vehicles.
You cannot.
But with the direct air capture, then of course it doesn't matter. I mean, you capture CO2 from the atmosphere, and the source is no link to the source in that sense. And aviation, of course, you could of course not apply anything else, and therefore for aviation it could be aviation. I mean, there are very few you could change fuel to biomass, but it's enormous amount of biomass, and of course we have a lot of sectors that want to use biomass. And of course the substitution possibilities in aviation are very limited. So, I mean, there is for sure development of electric airplanes, but I mean those will be for very short distances. I think over the foreseeable future. So, in that sense, direct air capture could play a role. Absolutely.
But if you go for a single source of CO2 emissions, it seems to me that power generation, electricity generation, is the single largest area where you could make CCS work on a large scale. Is that right?
Yes, but actually, if you look at Sweden recently, the main interest now, I would say, is more in the basic industry. So these that I mentioned, steel and cement and those, because it's very difficult for them to find any other. And we do not, of course, have big coal power plants here in Sweden. Right. But there's also been actually an interest from the municipality-owned, like combined heat and power plants. So, for instance, Stockholm Exergi, they are looking into and actually starting up now a small pilot test with carbon capture. So actually in Sweden there are 3 companies that are discussing this, and it's Stockholm Exergi, the district heating company of City of Stockholm, and there is Cementa Heidelberg, which is a part of Heidelberg Cement, because we mentioned before that it's difficult for them to reduce emissions to zero. And then it's a Preem refinery for the hydrogen production.
But these are specific for Sweden, which is in some sense abnormal.
I mean,
no electricity from fossil.
No.
So if you move to Germany, the situation is totally different.
Different, absolutely. So I mean, globally, it's there's of course a big need for I mean, in the like China and India, it's very scary in the sense that there for sure is a growth in renewable, like electricity, which is very good in solar and wind. So that's good news. But the bad news is that if you look at the growth in the fossil fuel, it's outcompetes the growth in and from very much higher levels as well. So for these countries, and as I mentioned before, that they also have large reserves of coal, then you would typically, it's an important option. I mean, because the other way would be that they leave their fossil fuels in the ground, and that seems very unlikely.
Right.
Unfortunately, that seems even more unlikely that what is still a bit unlikely that CCS will be applied. So, but I think this goes back to that main argument. In Europe, you could argue that we don't have that much fossil fuel. So even in Germany, if you look at the phase-out decision of the lignite, the brown coal-fired power plants in Germany now, that's probably if they can maintain and follow that's probably could be a good decision. But the only country, you need to go only to Poland, and they of course obstruct any more strict change of the targets. So they could possibly use it, or if they're going to comply with the climate targets, they have the same choice. Either they leave their coal reserves in the ground, or they apply CCS and a combination.
So you talked a bit about the capture step, not so much about the transportation and storage. And you briefly mentioned that in Iceland they store it in their basalt.
Yeah, basalt formations. It's underground as well.
Underground, so what could you say about the storage? Because typically you would use some other areas.
No,
storage.
I mean the storage. I put forward those 3 main arguments for CCS, but the conditions for CCS is of course that there is large storage capacity around the world. Otherwise, it would be any meaning to look at it. And in our neighborhood, it's the North Sea, under the sea floor, where there are large. They are referred to as aquifers, but it's not those that you take up drinking water from. It's deep down, and they could be. I mean, they don't know if it's water or land on above them. So you find those in many places, both onshore and offshore. And these are sort of porous sandstone-like formations with a cap rock on top. And so what you do after you have captured the CO2, you compress it, so it becomes actually supercritical, so it's like a fluid. So the volume is very, compared to a gas, very, very low, small volume. And then you transport it by boat or by pipeline, and then you pump it down inject it into one of those aquifers, which of course need to be reasonably well defined, and that's through seismic investigations. And sort of the irony is that, of course, Norway have lots of these data because the oil and gas industry they do that, so that's fairly well documented there. So for Sweden and actually north of Europe, it's a tremendous large storage potential in the North Sea. So now at the moment, the Norwegians, with Equinor, former Statoil, they are actually trying to find a new business by wanting CO2 emissions from all around Europe, I would say, or at least the northern part of Europe, including Sweden. So we sometimes a little bit joke about that they not only do they make money of pumping up oil and gas, which emit CO2 to the atmosphere, now they will also get rich on storing the CO2. So
perfect.
So, but it's important to say that it's not like a big pressurized tank or something below the ground, but it's deep down, and that migrates into that saturated salt water in the aquifers slowly, and so for instance, a typical question one gets asked when presenting about CCS is, can it sort of leak? And of course it can, but it's and that's actually a problem with public attitudes to CCS, that you would be lying if you say it cannot leak, but if there is a leakage, it will be very slow, and it's nothing really that physically points to that it should leak, because there's very high pressure there, and it was sort of, there's a cap rock you above, so it's basically not an issue of this leakage. And then when it comes to but you could also store in old emptied gas and oil fields.
But you mentioned, like this case, now we're talking about sandstone typically, and here you wouldn't have the mineralization process that you mentioned that they have in Iceland.
Yes and no. I mean, it's there, but it takes many years. Thousands or maybe even 100,000 years, but if first it gets dissolved in the water, and then it starts a very slow carbonation process. But a good thing is that if it hasn't leaked the first year or the first 20 years, or the probability of a leakage goes
decreases,
down, of course. So.
And that's the main challenge then, though, for the storage. It's just a leakage, then there are no really...
Oh, I wouldn't say that's a challenge. That's not a challenge. I mean, the challenge, I don't think there is... I mean, the challenge maybe more, again, is related to that we get it started, the cost to all that we discussed before. There are some regulatory issues for exporting CO2 cross-border. That was actually one of them, were partly at least, or perhaps even completely resolved last week, as in relation to the London Protocol, which is the dumping convention. And there is also a challenge if we talk about negative emission from biogenic emissions, because there are no incentives at all. For the fossil ones we have the EU ETS, but for the biogenic emissions we have no, because it's regarded as there are no that they are. I mean, CO2 is CO2, so it doesn't matter if they're fossil or biogenic. But but there is now a governmental assessment being made on looking at those, how to create incentives for these negative emissions. When it comes to transport, there are systems. It's no big deal. I mean, it's standard technology, but I think it's more a challenge how to get it started. I mean, the first you can't start with a big pipeline for the first company that will apply CCS, because that will be very expensive. So you will start with boat transportation, which is there's no difficult thing, but of course you need to invest in a boat, and also that system that they are developing currently in Norway, where the Equinor is developing an infrastructure. So that would be like a intermediate storage. So the boat, say, goes from Slite, Gotland, if it will be implemented there, the cement factory, and then to this southwest of Norway, and unload the CO2, and then it would be an intermediate storage, and then there will be pipelines down and stored in
where they have
formation.
the infrastructure, I guess, then from the oil.
Yeah, I mean they will build this new infrastructure, but they know how to do it, and they have of course a lot of equipment for doing that, drilling and all that underwater technology. So they have planned a project, and there will be in the Nordic countries. The first demonstration project will most likely be in Norway at cement Norcem, which is the Norwegian part of the Heidelberg cement, and so in south of Norway, and also hopefully at the combined heat and power plant burning waste fuels in the south of Oslo, Clemensrud. So these will be the two large-scale test units in Nordic countries.
So you have painted a picture where the technology to collect a lot of CO2 for the main sources exists. It's really not a research need. It's more a technology application need, and barriers are mainly economical, I would say. So to, for example, reduce the dominating CO2 emissions from 50% of the Earth's electricity generation, you have the technology. It's just accepting a price change we discussed up to a factor of 50% or a factor of 2. But if you accept that the majority of CO2 emissions could in the medium near future, say tens of years, be reduced very significantly, and maybe to the levels that meet IPCC predictions or requests. Let me ask a question that is more sci-fi, science fiction oriented, and that is, when we talked about storage, you talked about oil, natural gas and oil sources in the North Sea, for example. But there are researchers who try to invent some method of using the CO2 instead. For example, using the CO2 as a raw material in artificial photosynthesis. Would you say that should wait, or should one pursue such research still to make even valuable products of the CO2 that is collected?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's actually often now when you see CCS in literature or in documents, for instance, from the European Commission or from different countries' strategies, it's called CCUS, so carbon capture, utilization and storage. And well, there is a variety of these. What is the meaning of utilization? Sometimes it's meant this EOR I mentioned, enhanced oil recovery, and obviously it's not a sort of a good, strong climate mitigation measure. But there are also a variety of other things. You can make electrofuels. I mean, you can make transportation fuels. I mean, of the CO2. And of course, CO2 has no. I mean, it's low. It's not really an energy. You have already converted everything, so it's not energy content wise. It's low. So, I mean, there's a tremendous amount of CO2 or carbon that we emit. So, it cannot really be a big thing, because you would need to either to produce enormous amount of solid material or whatever to use to produce from it. Or if you produce, for instance, the fuel or something, you always have to look at where will the carbon, the atoms be released in the end. And of course, if you make a transportation fuel, so you're back to the problem that of course once you burn it in an engine, the carbon is distributed and you can't collect it easily. So in that sense, that's not. I mean, of course, you can argue that you substitute virgin oil or gas that should be used that don't need to be taken up. So, but I think those are could maybe be used as an intermediate thing. But the problem is that again, it's not that many years until we need to reduce emissions to zero. So I find it not very likely that you could build up some industrial system which will only be viable in a climate mitigation from a climate mitigation point of view for say 10 years, and then you will stop it. So but what you mentioned, algae and this kind of thing, if you can use it to enhance photosynthesis and so on, you may have a net effect, depending of course where you use the biomass then for. But so in that sense, there are definitely some niche applications to it, but not the big strong climate
and
mitigation.
It's much longer term than applying CCS directly.
Yeah. I mean, you could think in the future maybe you have a carbon source. You combine hydrogen from renewables with some carbon source, and you make some electric fuels or something like that. But it will be very costly and far into the future. Again, you have the aviation, because I think aviation is very special because it seems very unlikely that we should stop flying, and I mean it's increasing. So. In particular in countries where economy is growing fast, so and it's an enormous amount of fuel, our carbon-based fuel you need for aviation. So I think that sector we need something. But in the end, of course, you can combine hydrogen from renewables with some carbon source, and in that sense, you may call that carbon capture and utilization. But that's if it should really. You say you capture the CO2 from a biogenic point source, and you combine it with hydrogen from renewables, and you make some aviation fuel, possibly.
In some way, it's a different story. So it's enough to solve the problem of applying CCS large scale.
I can. That's definitely should be the main priority. It's very powerful. I mean, we showed in a study that if you take as I said, Sweden's total CO2 emissions, not greenhouse gas, but CO2 emissions is about around 43 megaton per year. And we looked at 27 of the industrial plants. Actually, of those industrial plants that emits more than 0.5 megaton per year, there are 27 or 28 of those. And if you apply CCS on those, it's a mixture of biogenic and fossil fueled emission sources. You will capture more that corresponds to more than half of the Swedish total CO2 emissions. The only 27 units we can reduce half of our CO2 emissions. So in that sense, CCS is very powerful because.
Okay.
I'm very grateful that you came here and educated me. And you've convinced me what is the right path to go. So let's unite forces to get that road going.
Yeah. I mean, I would very strongly also argue, I mean, of course, CCS is definitely required, but of course, we equally need everything else as well. So, I mean, renewables are, of course, also extremely important.
It's an important part of the whole puzzle.
Exactly. It's a portfolio. I mean, we need everything.
Key
so absolutely,
In some way, you can see the analogy with solar electricity, that the technology is there. It's not just a matter of getting sufficient speed on expanding it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think that's all we had for today. Yeah, that was a great introduction to the topic of CCS. So thank you for listening to this episode of Science on Surfaces, a bigger perspective on the small. With me, Malin Edvardsson, Bengt Kasemo, Professor of Physics at Chalmers University of Technology, and Filip Johnson, Professor at the Division of Energy Technology at Chalmers as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I also wanted to take the opportunity to mention that if you're interested in surface science and surface-related phenomena, you should check out our blog, the Surface Science blog. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.